The storm had battered the Absaroka Range for 2 nights straight so fiercely that even the tallest lodgepole pines bowed like tired soldiers. When dawn finally came, it wasn't the gentle welcome of light over the Wyoming ridges. It was silence. Absolute sharp silence that follows a storm that has spent every ounce of fury. The snow had settled in sculpted waves across Daniel Brooks's ranch. For 71 years he had seen winters come and go, but he had never seen his land buried like this. The fences reduced to faint lines, the cattle huddled in barns like shadows pressed against wood. He stepped out with his coffee the same way he always did, carrying the ritual of warmth into the brittle cold. Daniel's boots sank halfway down each step as he trudged toward the barn. What he expected to find was damaged posts, bent wire snapped, maybe one of the old sheds flattened by drifts. What he did not expect was the small, uneven mound pressed against the north wall of the equipment shed. He paused, squinted, and felt his chest tighten. It wasn't a log. It wasn't debris. Something about it was too still, too perfectly shaped against the wind-hardened snow. He set his mug down on the railing and took each step carefully, the sound of his breath louder than anything else. The silence felt wrong, as though the forest itself was waiting to see what he would do. He pulled his glove tighter and knelt. What he brushed free with his mitten was not wood or ice. It was fur. A deep brown tangled with frost, tipped with white shards of ice. His stomach dropped. It was a grizzly bear cub. Its ears were stiff with frost, the tiny paws curled into its chest as if the animal had tried to fold itself into a smaller ball against the cold. Grizzly cubs in the Rockies were supposed to be safe in winter dens with their mothers. Something had gone terribly wrong, perhaps a den collapse or separation during the blizzard. Daniel knew enough about forest animals to recognize the signs of hypothermia. Shallow breaths, a faint shiver, eyes shut tight. A rare animal in this condition doesn't usually live through the night. For a long time he just stared, torn between awe and dread. A grizzly, even a cub, wasn't the kind of creature a man invited close. He remembered stories from neighbors who'd lost sheep chicken coops, raided, sometimes even cattle killed. And yet here, this one was fragile, half gone. The obvious choice was to leave it. Nature is cruel, and on a ranch you learn to let go. Predators and prey have their cycles, and a man interfering can tilt the balance in ways he shouldn't. But another thought slid in stubborn as a splinter. This wasn't just about a bear, it was about life hanging on by a thread. In his mind's ear, he heard his late wife's voice, the way Eleanor used to say, "Everything's just trying to make it to the next sunrise." She had always left scraps for Jays and scolded him for driving deer from her flower beds. And right now, staring at the cub, Daniel felt that same tug respect for the struggle itself. He hesitated. What if he carried it inside and it woke in panic? Even a cub had claws sharp enough to shred through heavy gloves. What if it were diseased? What if someone reported him the Wyoming Game and Fish Department had strict laws about keeping wildlife? A grizzly cub could not simply become part of his barn like a strayed dog. The law was clear, but so was the fact that the animal would die if he walked away. The decision took less than a minute, but it felt like hours. He pulled his wool blanket from the barn wall, knelt again, and began sliding it beneath the cub's tiny frame. At first, it did not move at all, only the faintest rise and fall of ribs. Then, as the rough wool tucked around it, a weak twitch ran through one paw like a last attempt at protest. That faint movement told him everything there was still a spark. He lifted the cub, surprised by how light it was. The weight of a calf's leg no more. He carried it against his chest, cradled not like a pet, but like a responsibility. Each step back to the workshop crunched louder, his breath fogging in front of his scarf, his heart pounding with questions he could not yet answer. Inside, he placed the bundle on burlap sacks near the pot-bellied stove. He did not push the heat too close. Experience taught him that frozen animals, like frozen pipes, cracked when rushed. He eased the fire, let the warmth creep slowly. And then he sat. Coffee cooling gloves still on, watching. The cub did not stir. As hours passed, Daniel's mind wandered. He thought about other times he had found forest animals on the edge of life, an elk tangled in wire, a hawk grounded by a broken wing. Every time he had made the same calculation: act or walk away. And every time he acted even knowing it might change nothing. The act itself mattered. Wildlife rescue in his own small way was never about turning his ranch into an animal sanctuary. It was about acknowledging that wild lives, even the rare ones, deserved the same chance as his cattle in the barn. By mid-afternoon, he noticed a tremor. The cub's ears flicked, not much, but enough to prove the body still fought. That single flicker filled the room with tension. Would it survive? Would it wake enraged? The fire popped. He shifted on his stool but did not move closer. He gave it space. Often the hardest part of compassion is not the saving, but the waiting. Action can be quick, heroic, in the moment. Waiting requires patience, the kind that stretches minutes into years. And there was another lesson, quieter still. Life in the mountains often looks empty, just wind, snow, and silence. But hidden in that silence is 1,000 small battles. Rabbits tunneling under snow. Owls are conserving energy on low branches. A grizzly cub huddled against a shed wall, clinging to breath. Daniel realized the storm hadn't just buried his land. It had exposed something raw, how fragile, and yet how stubborn survival really is. The mystery hung there. Why was this cub alone? Where was its mother? Could it even make it through the night? He had no answers. Only the sight of a small body refusing to give up. That refusal, more than anything, kept him watching through the long Wyoming evening. As darkness began to slide down the ridges, Daniel stoked the stove again, his eyes never leaving the bundle of wool. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring in himself too. Not just worry, but hope, sharp and surprising. A connection had formed, thin but real. He leaned back to the chair, creaking under his weight. Outside, the wind had stilled. Inside, another storm brewed quietly. What happens when a frozen grizzly bear cub, fragile but fierce, wakes not in the safety of its den, but in a rancher's workshop? That question would soon demand an answer, one that would push Daniel further than he ever imagined. Daniel Brooks sat on the stool in his workshop, the faint glow of the pot-bellied stove giving shape to the bundle of wool on the burlap sacks. He could still feel the weight of the grizzly bear cub against his chest from earlier light, yet full of consequence. The question pressed on him, now heavier than the snow piled outside. What have I just done? The storm had forced his hand. A man alone on a ranch does not often invite wild animals into his space, least of all a predator that could grow into something powerful enough to crush him. And yet here he was, waiting for a rare animal to stir in the corner of his own workshop. The impossible choice wasn't just about saving a life. It was about breaking rules written by law and by nature. Daniel knew well that Wyoming Game and Fish enforced strict regulations. If an officer walked through his door, they could fine him, strip him of his license, or even seize his property. The law was clear. Wild animals, especially grizzlies, considered threatened in parts of the Rockies, belonged under the authority of wildlife officials, not private citizens. If a man found a cub, he was supposed to call the number posted in town, wait for a truck, and let experts handle it. But the law did not stand in the workshop with him. What stood there was a breathing choice wrapped in a horse blanket, with the faintest tremors of life fighting against the odds. Daniel thought of his wife Eleanor again, how she used to remind him that compassion is not convenient. She would set out suet for chickadees even when the wind howled. She once stayed up all night nursing a neighbor's dog after a car accident, even though it wasn't hers to save. For her, doing the right thing was rarely tidy. He pictured what calling in the cub would mean. It might be euthanized if officials judged it unfit to survive, or taken away to a facility far from the mountains, raised in an animal sanctuary where it would never feel snow again. He respected sanctuaries. They served a purpose, housing endangered animals, rehabilitating those injured by roads or poachers, but he also knew they were a last resort. A grizzly's place was in the wild, not behind fences. He thought of examples from his own life. Years earlier, He had stumbled across a fawn caught in barbed wire near his fence line. By the time he freed it, the animal's leg was mangled. He had called authorities then, and the game warden had no choice but to put the creature down. Daniel had never forgotten the gunshot echoing in the hollow. He told himself then, if I ever have a chance to tip the scale toward life, I will. That memory clung to him now as tightly as the snow clung to his boots. So he weighed the options. On one side, legality, safety. The logic that said predators are dangerous even as cubs. On the other hand, a life fragile and stubborn, still flickering under the blanket. For a rancher used to balancing books, feed and weather, this was a different kind of math. He rose from the stool and walked a slow circle around the room, talking aloud as if Eleanor still sat by the fire. "If I let you go now," he murmured, glancing at the cub, "you won't last an hour. And if I call them, they'll take you somewhere you don't belong." He stopped, rubbed his temples. So maybe the only choice is the one no one would call smart. Maybe the only choice is to keep you alive tonight and see what tomorrow brings. That was the fresh perspective settling in. Sometimes rules fit paper better than they fit life. A law can tell you what not to do, but it cannot measure the weight of a breathing creature in your arms. A protocol can tell you who to call, but it cannot answer the silence of a workshop where death lingers just a few breaths away. Daniel realized that the real choice was between fear and faith. Fear said, "Protect yourself, let the wild take its course." Faith said, "Trust that compassion, even risky compassion, might create a different ending." The small lesson in that moment was not about grizzlies alone. It was about how often in life we stand between two paths, one that feels safe but cold, and one that feels dangerous but human. Most people choose safety. Daniel, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, chose humanity. He returned to the stool, poured himself more coffee, though it had grown bitter, and committed to the decision. He would keep watch through the night, keep the fire steady, and give this cub a chance. He did not know what sunrise would bring, but he knew this. The choice to save was not just about the cub. It was about keeping part of himself alive, too, the part that believed the bond between man and wild animals could still matter. The mystery deepened as he watched the cub's flank rise and fall. Why had the cub been alone in the storm? Was its mother lost in an avalanche? Was there a den nearby waiting for a cub that would never return? He had no answers. The unanswered questions made the silence heavier, but also gave his vigil purpose. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on knees, and whispered, "Just make it through the night." His voice was steady, his heart less so. He understood now that the impossible choice was never about whether to save. It was about accepting the unknown cost of that saving. The workshop smelled of pine smoke and damp wool. Daniel Brooks sat by the stove, his chair angled so he could watch the blanket-wrapped grizzly bear cub without intruding. The fire crackled softly, the flames licking slowly at the seasoned logs. Time moved like syrup. Hours stretched thin. The cub did not stir, and Daniel kept his distance, knowing too much heat too soon could do more harm than good. It wasn't instinct that told him this. It was experience. In winters past, he had seen neighbors lose livestock, not to the cold itself, but to what came after. He remembered a calf pulled from a snowdrift one January, carried inside too quickly. The family had set it down in front of a roaring fire, certain they had saved it. Within an hour, the animal was gone. Its heart had given out, overwhelmed by the shock of sudden heat. That memory returned now, like a warning. If this cub had any chance, it had to be warmed as carefully as a fading ember coaxed back into flame. So Daniel worked patiently. He stoked the stove little by little, feeding it pine, letting the warmth seep gradually across the room. He adjusted the cub's blanket, not too tight, not too loose, always keeping a layer of burlap between the body and the stove's direct heat. He poured water into a shallow pan, set it near but not within reach, ready for when thirst overtook fear. And then he waited. Waiting is harder than acting. A man can chop wood, mend a fence, wrestle a steer, but to sit quietly while life hangs by a thread, that requires another kind of strength. The kind his wife Eleanor had always possessed in abundance. Daniel thought of her long nights nursing neighbors, of her steady hands on fevered foreheads. She had often told him, the hardest rescue is patience. Anyone can rush in, but not everyone can wait. As midnight came and went, Daniel felt that lesson pressed down on him. He could do nothing more than keep the fire steady and watch. The cub twitched occasionally, small tremors running through its paws and ears. Each tremor was both a promise and a threat. A promise that the body still fought, and a threat that the fight could fail at any moment. The stillness gave Daniel time to consider the broader picture. What he was doing was not standard wildlife rescue. Licensed biologists and animal sanctuary workers had protocols, equipment, and teams. He had none of that. Just wool blankets, a stove, and his stubborn resolve. In truth, if wildlife officers discovered him, they might say he was putting himself and the cub at risk. And maybe they'd be right. But standing there, he couldn't shake the thought that rules are written for average days, not for blizzards that strip the mountains bare. He whispered, "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" His words weren't meant to calm the cub. It couldn't understand him, but perhaps they calmed him. Talking kept the silence from swallowing him whole. Toward dawn, the first sign came. A shudder ran through the cub's frame, long and deep like a storm front rolling across the plains. Its body jerked, its claws flexed, and then it fell still again. Daniel leaned forward, his coffee cooling untouched in his hands. Another minute, then another tremor. He held his breath. The cub's head shifted slightly, muzzle pressing against the burlap, as if searching for something it couldn't name. This was the moment of risk. Survival and shock danced side by side. Too much stimulation and the cub might panic or collapse. Too little and the cold might reclaim it. Daniel did what Eleanor would have done. He stayed steady. He didn't rush to comfort, didn't crowd the fragile creature. He simply tended the fire, kept his own breathing even, and let the warmth continue its slow work. The lesson in that moment was clear to him. Life doesn't always need saving by force. Sometimes it needs space. People, like wild animals, often return from hardship, not because someone pulled them, but because someone waited beside them, quietly holding ground. When the cub finally opened its eyes, the workshop seemed to hold its breath. Two small orbs of dark brown blinked unfocused at first, then sharper, darting across the strange walls and lingering on the shape of the man by the stove. The sound that followed was low and rough, a hiss rumbling deep in the cub's throat. It was fear, pure and ancient. Daniel did not flinch. He stayed still, letting the cub's gaze pass over him like a storm cloud over the ridges. Rescuing wild animals does not mean earning their gratitude. The cub would never lick his hand like a dog or curl at his feet like a cat. Gratitude was a human invention. In the wild, survival is its own language, one he would never fully translate. The cub might live or die, might vanish back into the forest animal's hidden world, might one day even return as a danger to him. None of that mattered. What mattered was that tonight he had chosen to give it a chance. He thought of other people too, neighbors who had once told him stories of pulling rare animals from snowdrifts or finding owls grounded by storms. Most had called wildlife officers immediately. Some had lost the animals before help arrived. A few had succeeded in handing them over to animal sanctuaries. Each story ended differently, but each began with the same truth you don't forget the night you sat with a life balanced on the edge. The cub shifted again, pushing itself up on shaky paws. It stumbled, nearly toppled, then found its footing. Daniel watched as it backed into the shadows beneath the workbench, eyes gleaming, body trembling. It wanted distance, and he gave it that. He set down a plate of venison scraps, slid a bowl of water nearby, and returned to his stool. He would not press further. If the cub was meant to take sustenance, it would do so on its own terms. This, too, was a lesson. You cannot control how wild animals accept rescue. You can only make the space provide what you can and let instinct decide the rest. The night ended with the first pale light of morning slipping through the frosted window. Daniel rubbed his eyes stiff from sitting so long, but inside he felt lighter. Something had shifted, not just the cub, but himself. In waiting and holding back, he had rediscovered a patience he thought had died with Eleanor. The mystery of the cub's future still loomed large, but so did a strange sense of peace. he whispered. "One night down. Let's see if we can make it another." By the second morning, the workshop felt different. The grizzly bear cub was no longer a bundle of fur wrapped in wool, but a restless body with sharp eyes. It had survived the cold. Now it was testing the limits of the space it found itself in, pacing back and forth beneath the workbench, its claws clicking against the wood, its breaths quick and uneven. Daniel Brooks sat on his stool, coffee in hand, watching as the cub eyed the window, then the door, then him. The fear had not gone away. It had changed shape. The night before, the cub had trembled at the edge of death. Now it trembled with instinct, ready to fight or flee if pushed. Daniel knew enough about wild animals to recognize the signal's ears, pinned back muscles tensing with every movement. A grizzly cub may be small, but even small predators carry a language of danger. He remembered a neighbor years ago who had pulled a raccoon from a trap and brought it into his shed. The animal survived, but once it regained its strength, it turned the shed upside down. Tools scattered, feed bags, shredded shelves toppled. What had been an act of kindness nearly became a disaster. That story came back to Daniel now like a warning: survival changes behavior. A weak creature accepts help, a strong one defends itself. So Daniel adjusted his approach. He didn't reach toward the cub. He didn't corner it. Instead, he worked around the edges. He placed water 10 feet from the shadows. He set scraps of venison just within reach. Then he returned to his stool posture, loose gaze steady, but non-threatening. He remembered what Eleanor had taught him with stray dogs. Don't make eye contact unless you're ready for a challenge. Let them choose when to trust. It was a kind of wildlife rescue that looked like doing nothing, but in truth, it was the most important part. The cub needed to relearn strength without learning dependence. That fine line, help without taming, was the heart of every ethical decision in rescuing rare animals. Animal sanctuaries wrestled with it daily, how to provide care without stealing wildness. Daniel, alone in his workshop, was learning the same lesson in real time. As hours passed, the cub began to explore. First it crept from the shadows, muscles tight, head low. Then it sniffed at the bowl of water, lapped once, and retreated quickly. Minutes later, it tried again, this time staying long enough to drink. Hunger came next. With sudden speed, it grabbed the venison scraps and darted back beneath the bench. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. Each step forward was a victory, though not one he could claim. The example reminded him of a story from his youth when he and his brother once found a hawk grounded in a field wing broken. They had carried it to a barn, fed it scraps of rabbit. The hawk survived, but instead of flying away, it lingered circling the farmyard, perching on posts. It had learned to associate food with people. Within weeks, it was struck by a passing truck on the county road. The memory stayed sharp. Kindness without caution can harm more than help. That thought weighed on him now as he watched the cub grow more active. He whispered, "You're not meant to know me. You're meant to forget me." It was a strange thing to say aloud, but it felt right. His role was not to become part of the cub's story, but to step aside once it was strong enough to continue on its own. Compassion has boundaries. True care for wild animals does not mean drawing them closer. It means knowing when to let them remain apart. People often forget this. They treat wildlife like pets, feed them in backyards, or post close encounters on social media. But wildness is fragile. A bear cub that learns to trust humans too much may never survive in the forest again. Daniel knew this, and he would not let his workshop become a cage. By evening, the cub had grown bolder. It leapt onto the workbench, scattering old tools, then onto a pile of firewood. Its body moved with a growing rhythm, a reminder that grizzlies are born climbers, explorers, survivors. Daniel kept his seat, speaking occasionally in a calm, low voice, but never stepping closer. He was no master here, only a witness. The fresh perspective came to him slowly, almost like a prayer. Not every rescue ends with gratitude or connection. Some rescues end with distance, and that distance is sacred. He thought of people who had tried to keep wild animals as pets, only to see tragedy follow. He thought of sanctuaries crowded with endangered animals that had lost their instinct to fear. This cub, if it survived, needed fear. Fear would keep it alive when it returned to the ridges and the rivers where wolves, cougars, and harsher storms waited. As night fell again, Daniel checked the fire, set another bowl of water, and whispered a simple promise into the silence. "Tomorrow, you'll be stronger still, and when the time comes, I'll let you go." The third morning came clear and sharp, the kind of winter dawn that painted every snowdrift in shades of rose and silver. Daniel Brooks stepped into the workshop and found the grizzly bear cub no longer hiding beneath the bench, but standing in the open, head-high paws planted firm. Its eyes locked onto him not with weakness, but with something closer to defiance. The rescue was complete. Now came the part Daniel had dreaded from the beginning, letting it go. He poured himself coffee, though his hands trembled more than the cup. For 3 days he had built a strange bond with this rare animal. Not a bond of trust, but a bond of shared survival. He had kept the fire steady, offered food, respected distance. The cub had accepted enough to live. That should have been the end of it. But endings, he realized, rarely come easy. The dilemma was simple in words and impossible in practice. If he kept the cub even for a few more days, it might become too accustomed to him. Habituation, as wildlife officers called it, could doom a bear. A grizzly cub that learned to see humans as safety might one day approach a rancher's porch or a camper's tent. And when that happened, fear and bullets would follow. The very act of saving it now could plant the seed of its destruction later. On the other hand, if he released it too soon, weakened muscles and lingering exhaustion could finish what the blizzard had started. The forest animals waiting beyond the ridge, the coyotes, the wolves, the mountain lions, would not show mercy. Nature is impartial, and a half-strong cub would be no match for the hunger that ruled the wild. Daniel thought of an example from years ago. A neighbor had once found an abandoned black bear cub near a stream. Instead of calling authorities, the family raised it for weeks in their barn. By the time wildlife rescue officers learned of it, the cub had imprinted. It followed people like a dog, nudged for food, and showed no fear. The officers had no choice but to send it to an animal sanctuary. The bear lived but behind fences, pacing the same patch of earth day after day. It never felt the sweep of a valley wind or the rush of a river again. That memory weighed on him now like a stone. So he stood in the workshop, staring at the cub, weighing futures. Hard release, soft release. The terms floated through his mind. Hard release meant opening the door, stepping aside, letting the cub vanish into the timber. Quick, final, risky. Soft release meant keeping it longer. Maybe building an enclosure, feeding it with less contact, easing it back into the wild. Slower, safer in theory, but dangerous in ways less visible. A cub too comfortable with human scent might never belong fully to the forest again. He whispered, "Which one gives you the better chance?" The cub didn't answer, of course. It simply padded toward the window nose, twitching at the scent of pine carried faintly through the cracks. Instinct was already calling it back. Sometimes mercy means letting go before you feel ready. People hold on to animals, to memories, to loved ones, thinking that safety lies in prolonging the moment. But true compassion, he realized, was not about clinging. It was about releasing even when the heart argued otherwise. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel put on his coat and gloves, walked to the heavy workshop doors, and pressed his hand against the cold wood. He felt his pulse in his palm. Then with a grunt, he pushed. The doors groaned open, spilling light and a rush of mountain air into the dim room. The cub froze ears forward, every muscle tight. The smell of the wild came flooding in pine snow, the faint musk of elk moving somewhere on the slopes. For a long moment, nothing happened. Daniel stood beside the door, silent, steady. The cub's eyes flicked to him, then back to the opening. It was a pause filled with mystery, as if the cub weighed him the same way he had weighed it. Then, with sudden power, it bolted. Paws pounded across the snow, sending up sprays of white. In seconds, it vanished over the ridge, swallowed by the vast silence of the Absaroka Range. Daniel lowered his hand from the doorframe, chest tight. Relief mixed with emptiness. He had given it back to the wilderness, but the workshop felt hollow without the restless energy that had filled it. He closed the doors slowly, the echo ringing louder than he expected. He thought again of animal sanctuaries and the debate around them. Sanctuaries gave rare and endangered animals safety, food, and care, but they also took away their freedom. Freedom with all its risks was what made wild animals wild. The fresh perspective for Daniel was this: true wildlife rescue doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it means trusting the unknown, releasing what you've saved back into a world that may still break it. He sat that night on his porch, coffee cooling beside him, staring at the dark line of trees. He imagined the cub stumbling, then righting itself, learning once more how to hunt, how to climb, how to fear. He prayed silently, not for gratitude, not for return, but simply for survival. The bond between man and wild was not meant to last. It was meant to tip the balance, then disappear. Winter gave way to thaw. Snow receded from the fence lines, revealing broken posts and downed branches. Daniel Brooks spent his days hauling wood tightening wire, mending what the blizzard had undone. Weeks passed, and the grizzly bear cub faded into memory, until the afternoon when silence fell in a way that carried weight. Daniel was at the far edge of his land chainsaw, resting on a stump when he noticed it. The birds that had filled the trees with chatter had gone quiet. The small forest animals that usually rustled through the undergrowth were still. The silence was not peace, it was a warning. His skin prickled with the knowledge he had carried since boyhood. Something was watching. From the shadows beneath a stand of pine, a mountain lion emerged. Its body, his low shoulders, rippling eyes fixed on him with chilling focus. Daniel knew what that look meant. He had seen it once before in his youth when a cougar trailed elk near the river. But this time the gaze was not for prey in the distance. It was for him. At 71, with stiff joints and tired lungs, he knew he looked more like opportunity than threat. He thought of examples his neighbors had told him over coffee. Stories of cougars following hikers silently for miles, of sheep lost in minutes to a single strike. Mountain lions, though rarely seen, were apex predators in their own right. Against a man unarmed, his rifle was too far away, the odds tilted badly. Raised his arms, shouted, and tried to look larger. But before the sound fully left his throat, another figure erupted from the trees. A flash of brown spotted with faint scars. The grizzly bear cub, older, now heavier muscles rippling with months of survival, charged straight into the lion's path. What followed was chaos. The cub, still far smaller than the cougar, fought with reckless fury. It hissed, clawed, and launched itself at the predator's face. The cougar snarled, recoiled, slashed back. For seconds, they rolled in a blur of fur and sound until the cougar broke off, bleeding from shallow cuts, and melted back into the shadows with a final furious growl. Daniel stood frozen, chest heaving. The cub's staggered sides heaving, one ear notched just as he remembered. Their eyes met across the clearing. Not gratitude, not recognition in human terms, but something primal. A pause long enough for him to understand survival debt had been balanced. This moment revealed the predator hierarchy of the mountains in a way he had never witnessed. Grizzly bears, even as cubs, were fighters bred by evolution to withstand storms, wolves, and even rival bears. Mountain lions ruled differently through stealth, surprise, speed. Here the clash was less about dominance and more about disruption. The cub's attack had not been about saving Daniel. It had been about survival, about breaking the cougar's focus. In the wild, even rare animals make decisions measured in seconds: attack, retreat, live another day. Daniel remembered another example told by a wildlife officer years earlier. A pack of coyotes once cornered a black bear cub near a ranch. The mother returned, fought them off, and the cub lived. The officer explained it simply: predators live by a hierarchy. Sometimes the only thing that tips the scale is courage or confusion. The cub's charge today was exactly that. Courage does not always come from size or strength. Sometimes it comes from instinct, from the refusal to yield even when the odds scream otherwise. People often think survival is about who is strongest, but watching a cub drive off a cougar taught him that survival is just as much about surprise, persistence, and timing. The fresh perspective for him was sharper still. He had once thought of wildlife rescue as an act that ended in separation, the human stepping back, the animal vanishing. But today showed him that bonds can ripple unseen, shaping futures long after doors are opened. He hadn't raised the cub, hadn't trained it, hadn't made it tame. Yet something about their encounter in the storm had left a thread. The cub had lived, and living had led it here. In some mysterious way, their fates had crossed again, proving that compassion is never wasted. It moves outward, sometimes returning in forms you could never predict. The cub limped into the trees head low, but glanced once more over its shoulder. Daniel did not follow. He did not call out. He simply let the moment settle heavy and humbling. The hierarchy of predators had shifted for an instant, and he had been spared. He picked up his chainsaw again, hands still shaking, and whispered a prayer of thanks. Not to the cub, not even to fate, but to the wilderness itself for reminding him that life and death balance on edges thinner than a fence wire. The chainsaw was silent now, forgotten against the stump. Daniel Brooks stood in the clearing, his breath clouding in the cold air, staring into the place where the cougar had vanished. The grizzly bear cub, scarred, limping, ear-notched, paused just long enough for their eyes to meet. That single look lingered in Daniel's chest like a stone dropped into still water. It wasn't human gratitude, it wasn't affection, it was something older, something that reached back to a time before men built fences and cabins. The cub had acted out of instinct, but within that instinct was recognition, not in words, not in thought, but in presence. It was a moment where wild animals and humans shared a silent truth. Lives had crossed, debts had balanced. Daniel had spent his life around forest animals, watching elk migrate, wolves trail. Deer herds and black bears raid orchards in autumn. Yet this was different. A cougar turning back because of a cub's reckless charge was rare enough. But seeing the same cub he had once carried into his workshop, that was something else entirely. It was like finding your reflection in the most unlikely place. Never assume an animal remembers you. Wildness runs deeper than memory. Yet looking into those dark eyes, Daniel felt a flicker of something beyond coincidence. It might not have been memory in the way people hold it, but it was recognition of another kind, the recognition of survival shared. An example from his past returned. Years ago, he had found a hawk with a broken wing. After handing it to wildlife rescue, he thought the story was over. Months later, working his field, he had seen a hawk circle above, dipping low before climbing skyward again. Was it the same one? He would never know. But the moment left him with the same quiet question. Do wild animals carry threads of connection, invisible yet unbreakable? That same question burned now hotter than ever. Recognition does not always come wrapped in certainty. Sometimes it comes as a flicker, a pause, a glance across a clearing. It doesn't need proof to carry weight. In life, we spend too much time demanding evidence, photographs, or records. But in the wilderness, truth often arrives in silence, asking only to be felt. Daniel crouched slightly, not to approach, but to steady his knees, still trembling from adrenaline. The cub shifted its weight, winced, then turned toward the trees. He watched the muscles tighten, the paws dig into soft earth, the body melt into the shadows of the forest. In seconds, it was gone. Only the quiet remained. He stayed there for a long time, thinking about what recognition means when it isn't tied to ownership or control. People often assume that connection with wild animals must look like taming, touching, and bringing them into captivity. But the fresh perspective Daniel carried now was the opposite. The deepest recognition happens in distance. It happens when a creature stays wild, and you honor that wildness by letting it remain apart. That was what separated wildlife rescue from possession, the willingness to release, to trust that survival continues without your hand. Later that week, Daniel checked one of his trail cameras near the creek. On the screen flickered an image, a bear cub, notched ear-catching moonlight moving along the water's edge. The timestamp matched the days after the cougar encounter. Proof as much as he would ever get. He printed the photo, tacked it above his workbench, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Some rescues leave no return. Some, however, leave a trail you can follow, faint but real. He thought of endangered animals held in sanctuaries across the country. Wolves, eagles, even grizzlies, too habituated to survive in the wild. Their faces were known, their stories documented. But here in the Absaroka wilderness, he had his own story, less certain, but no less powerful. A rare animal had crossed his life twice, not as captive or dependent, but as wild as the day it was born. That was recognition enough. True recognition does not need to be mutual. It doesn't require the animal to feel what he felt. What mattered was that the encounter reshaped him, softened the edges of solitude, and reminded him that his life was still connected to something larger. He didn't need to be remembered. It was enough to remember. As he packed his tools and walked back toward the cabin, Daniel's steps were slower, more deliberate. He carried the weight of the encounter not as fear, but as a gift. It was proof that the wilderness was not indifferent. It noticed in ways beyond human language when kindness shifted the balance. That night on his porch, he poured coffee into his mug and stared at the dark ridgeline. He wondered if the cub was lying somewhere under a pine, licking its wounds, listening to the same wind. The mystery of it filled him not with emptiness, but with peace. Recognition, he realized, is not about certainty. It's about presence, about being awake to the moment when the wild looks back. The Absaroka range grew quiet with spring, the snow retreating up the slope, streams running wild with meltwater. Daniel Brooks spent his days mending fences, planting a small patch of garden, and walking the boundaries of his land. Life returned to its steady rhythm, yet something within him no longer matched that rhythm. The workshop, once filled with the restless energy of a grizzly bear cub fighting to live, felt emptier now. But the emptiness did not weigh as it once had. It carried a strange lightness, like space cleared for something new. He often found himself replaying the choices that had carried him from discovery to release. Each step was etched in his mind, lifting the frozen cub from the snow, waiting through nights of trembling silence, watching it find strength opening the door to the wild, and then seeing it charge a predator larger than itself. These weren't just events. They were turning points. Each one carried a lesson about patience, courage, and the fragile balance that shapes the lives of both humans and wild animals. His act of wildlife rescue had saved more than the cub. It had saved a part of himself. Years of solitude had dulled his sense of purpose. But in choosing to protect a rare animal even briefly, he had rediscovered the truth Eleanor had carried so gracefully, that compassion is not measured by outcome, but by intention. You don't save a life to earn thanks. You do it because life itself deserves the chance to continue. He thought often of sanctuaries he had read about in magazines, places where endangered animals found refuge after injury or human conflict. Sanctuaries carried their own beauty, providing safety when the wild could no longer do so. But his experience had taught him something different. Not all rescues belong behind fences. Some belong in the open, where risk and freedom still walk side by side. The grizzly cub's survival was never guaranteed. Yet the possibility of freedom made the risk worthwhile. Knowledge came to him in simple ways. He learned how quickly a body can shift from frozen silence to trembling life. He learned that predators are bound by hierarchies, each encounter shifting balances unseen. He learned that wild animals carry recognition not as memory, but as presence. And he learned that compassion, even unreturned, reshapes the heart of the one who gives it. These truths were not written in books. They lived in quiet hours beside a stove, in the hush of a clearing, in the silent gaze of a creature vanishing into the forest. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the peaks, Daniel sat on his porch with coffee untouched at his side. The breeze carried the scent of pine, sharp and sweet. He imagined the cub out there somewhere, moving through the forest animal's domain, perhaps licking scars, perhaps chasing squirrels, perhaps already carving its place among the hierarchy of wild things. He would never know for certain. And yet the mystery comforted him. Not knowing was part of the gift. He thought of an example Eleanor had once shared when they were younger. She had found a stray dog on a roadside, weak and frightened. She fed it, sheltered it for a week, then found its owner. When she handed the leash back, she cried. But later she told him, "That dog gave me more in 7 days than some people give in years." Sometimes we're only meant to hold on long enough to hand life back. Now, decades later, he finally understood. The cub had been his leash, his reminder, his proof that even in solitude he was still part of something larger. The small lesson he carried was this: connection is not ownership. To connect with wild animals, with people even with memory, is not to control, but to honor. Recognition is not about being remembered, it is about remembering. In remembering the cub, Daniel remembered himself. And the fresh perspective that lingered like dusk light was one he wanted to keep close. The world is full of endangered animals and rare creatures fighting battles unseen. Many will lose, some will survive. But every act of compassion, no matter how small, tips the balance in ways we may never witness. A frozen cub in a storm, a hawk lifted from a field, a deer freed from a fence. Each story is part of the same truth. Life is always worth the effort. Daniel leaned back, letting the chair creak under his weight. He smiled, faint but real. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the cub roamed free, and with it roamed a part of him he thought long gone. He whispered into the evening air, "Thank you, Eleanor." The words drifted, mingling with the sound of wind through the pines. Now, as you sit with this story, I invite you to reflect. Where in your own life have you faced the choice between safety and compassion? Have you ever stepped in to protect, to guide, to rescue, even knowing the outcome might be uncertain? These questions aren't just about wild animals. They are about us, about how we decide to meet the world each day. If this story of a grizzly bear cub and a man's impossible choice has touched you, let it remind you of the power you carry. You may never face a cougar in the forest, but you will face moments where patience, courage, or release are asked of you. In those moments, remember Daniel's lesson. Sometimes the greatest rescue is the one that frees both the saved and the saver. And if you'd like to continue walking these paths of wilderness and wonder with me, I'd be honored to have you along, like this video. If it spoke to you, subscribe for more stories of wild animals and the lessons they carry, and share it with someone who needs reminding that compassion is never wasted.